Welcome back, everybody, to the Marketplace of Ideas. I am your host, Charles Shakala. I'm on with Steven Gregory. Steven, how about you introduce yourself?
Hey Charles, it's really appreciate your offering the opportunity to be on your podcast. I'm Steve Gregory, and I'm a practicing lawyer. I've been practicing well over 30 years. I live in Alabama. I attended the University of Alabama School of Law. Graduated in 1991, and my history as a lawyer has been primarily as a litigator. I also do quite a bit of arbitration and mediation. I also have a podcast that I do with a co-host. It's called The Family Dinner Table, and Kim Fasking is my co-host. She's an immigration lawyer, and we talk about politics and some religion occasionally and current events. Many of the things you actually aren't supposed to talk about at the family dinner table, which is why we named it the family dinner table. So, um, sort of in my spare time, I follow the politics and the courts pretty closely, probably more closely than I should for my own mental health. But at any rate, that's something I like to do. And I appreciate your asking me on again.
Sure. All right. In our correspondence before the show, you sent me an article that you penned. I believe it was in July. Was it of this year? And it had an interesting proposal in there. So, a lot of you guys, I pride myself on critical thinking, especially when it comes to current events in the world around us. And any astute observer of the world around us, especially our media diets, knows that the Supreme Court was pretty contentious in the past couple of years. And not necessarily for the subject matters or the rulings of the court, but in how it functions. I was just telling Steven before we got on. By the way, is Steve okay?
Steve is great.
All
Yes.
right. So I was just telling Steve before we came on. Uh, I remember, my first election as a voter was actually the 2016 election, and I remember once Scalia died, the instantly in my head a bunch of things clicked, and I was like, oh my god, the Republicans have control of the Senate. They're not going to grant anything. It's a presidential cycle. It'll be an 8-person Supreme Court. Things will be deadlocked. This is even more riding on an unconventional election. There goes 2016. And I couldn't believe that McConnell seriously never granted a hearing. I remember reading articles saying Obama can sort of circumvent the Senate approval process. Here's how, and obviously we all know that we all know how that ended. Long story short, Trump won, and the Republicans' gamble paid off. So I was at that time, no, at the following semester, once Trump was elected, I remember being in an American judiciary class, and the uh, a very central focus of that class was judicial independence. And I guess the short version of judicial independence, Steve, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is how independent can the judiciary be of outside influences, be it political or cultural influences? Do they have to succumb to those influences or not? How do those influences impact their rulings, which would then impact the law nationwide? Am I doing good so far on judicial independence?
Yes, you are.
All right. So, and guys, you guys should know this, but I'm going to say it again. I am not a lawyer. I was about to go to law school. I did litigation paralegal work for a couple of years, but decided to go a different route. But still love this stuff. And I remember writing my final position in my term paper was judicial independence was not negatively impacted because by the Senate not granting Merrick Garland a hearing, the will of the people prevailed. But I did think that the values of democracy suffered because our system is not meant to be at a stalemate just to wait an outcome 8 months later. Of course, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the swift confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett is the definition of complete hypocrisy on the Republicans' end. And I do think we're in a pretty interesting position. And what led me to bring on Steve in this particular instance is about a year, maybe even two ago, Stephen Breyer released a book showing his approval, his blessing, his infatuation with the Supreme Court and its maintenance of a majority approval rating. Something that I'll show you later in a study for those of you watching us. I'll be showing screenshots of it and the web page itself. You guys will be able to see a Gallup poll that was released just last week in time for this podcast, appreciatively. And others came to visit our Supreme Court, and that's just how prominent it was. The Dobbs decision came back, overturning Roe versus Wade, and here we are now. So, Steve, how about you tell us what your version of the proposal is, and I'll be sure to link to it in the show notes for those interested in reading it directly.
All right, I appreciate that, Charles. And by the way, I went to law school when I was in my 30s, so you are still young enough to go to law school.
My in-laws are begging me to.
It's a trip, but it's probably a rewarding experience. I wouldn't say not to do it, but yeah. Thanks for asking me about the proposal. I was thinking about these issues and some of the issues you've been talking about. Justice Breyer has been, of course, a champion of the Supreme Court, and some of the sitting justices have made tours of the country, speaking tours, talking about how, well, no, we're not really contentious on the court. We sing happy birthday to each other and things like that. And so that sort of gets into some of the background of why I think that it might be a good idea to radically expand the size of the Supreme Court. And several of the background issues I'll talk about first. One is that we really do not have a very diverse Supreme Court. There were times in our history when the court was intellectually more diverse than it is today. Today, in both, oddly enough, in a religious sense and in an intellectual sense, in an educational or experiential sense, the Supreme Court is not very diverse. For example, and you know this, all the justices, except for Amy Barrett, who has been in the mold recently, all the justices except for Amy Barrett are Ivy League law school products. And we certainly have other wonderful law schools around the country.
Yep.
But that's not so much the issue as it is the fact that those 8 Supreme Court justices have such similar backgrounds. They were taught by the same law professors. They were, their fellow students were essentially the same kind of selected group.
Right. So I'm going to interrupt you there because and I'm sorry. This is just, I like to. I'm a Brooklyn guy. I have to jump on a point when I feel it. When I read that portion of your proposal, the diversity part of it really rung the bells of affirmative action to me. Not saying that you have a particular position one way or another, but the same argument I saw taking shape. So I remember in particular. So listen, I went to a public university. I went to Hunter College, City University of New York. I don't regret those days a bit. I spent one weekend in Princeton University, and I looked around at that during that one weekend, and I said, "Wow, the next Secretary of State, Secretary of Homeland Security will probably be right here sitting next to me." But you know what? In my public university, Hunter College, 63rd in Lexington or 68th in Lexington, I'm sitting next to somebody who's working 3 jobs, working and living with their grandmother, and paying this tuition out of the sweat of their brow. And this is America. So I sort of see what you're saying, because that one weekend I spent at Princeton, I'm like, if this is all anybody was subject to, I totally get it. The lack of diversity and the distance that they really have to everyday Americans. But that's not to say, I mean, you know, Alan Dershowitz, somebody I follow very closely and respect. He has a great line between him and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who actually grew up in the same area. What's the difference between a Ellis Island immigrant and a Supreme Court justice? His answer is one generation. So that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's line of, look at where I come from and look at what I provide. Even though she had a pristine academic and litigating experience, she still brought that. You still have geographic diversity. Let's say Chief Justice Roberts is still from Rochester, New York. He's not from New York City, like let's say Elena Kagan is, or Ginsburg was. There's still that geographic diversity, but the Ivy League diversity. I hear you. Let me press you a little bit on that. In that, should the Ivy League schools have a diversity mechanism built into their admissions process that would alleviate your diversity concerns with the court?
Well, I think they should, but I don't think that it would necessarily alleviate those concerns, because, again, part of my issue with the fact that the justices have all attended essentially the same law schools is that they have a shared experience in those law schools. They had the same law professors, similar law professors who came to those law schools through similar processes, and their fellow students are all pretty much like them. And I do think that some of the Ivy League law schools make an attempt to select from a more diverse population, but I think that they tend not to do a very good job of that. And and I wanted to say, you mentioned geographical diversity, so I have to jump in there. So, to a Brooklyn guy, there may not be a lot of difference. There may be a lot of difference between Rochester and Manhattan.
Tons, yeah.
But to a guy from Alabama, there isn't much. And
I
so
got it.
that's another point I wanted to make, or I did make in that essay, which is that we don't have a lot of geographical diversity on the court either. The members of the court right now are primarily from the Northeast, grew up in the Northeast. There is not a justice who grew up in the West. There's not one who grew up in the South or even the Midwest. They're all essentially from the Northeast. So there's not really a lot of geographical diversity on the court, and I think we would benefit from geographical diversity, not just in the sense of where they grew up, but in the sense of where they are now. And we'll get into that in a minute as we talk more about the proposal and the specifics of it. But and as you know, another area where I think there isn't sufficient diversity on the court, and other writers have touched on this as well, and that is religious diversity.
Right.
It's
What do you make? Okay, so I'm not quite sure. I mean, you mentioned this in your piece, but what do you make of Justice Jackson going pretty notably out of her way to say, I'm a non-denominational Christian? Do you think she had to say she was of a faith? And is it sort of more a step in the less, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say there must be some pressure to be of faith, or at least publicly be of faith, just like there is in running for any office these days. You can't necessarily run as an atheist. Senator Gillibrand as an exception, but you have to be of some faith. Now, the fact that Justice Jackson said that she was a non-denominational Christian, was that sort of a step away from this orthodoxy of you have to be of a faith, at least publicly? Because she didn't say she was a Protestant or a Catholic, or as one of my favorite commentators, Michael Smerconish, likes to say, he's a cafeteria Catholic. He takes some and leaves some. What do you make of that? Why did she go with non-denominational?
It is interesting, and I mentioned that actually in the
I still wanted to cover it live.
Right. So I can't say what her motives were, but perhaps it's related to the fact that many Americans these days are, one of the largest classes of people who answer questions about religious affiliations is none. these days the nuns are actually in the majority, I think, among classifications, or at least they exceed the number of many faiths or groups. And so I think it's a step towards that, not necessarily intentional on her part, and not a matter of signaling, but just the
Hmm.
fact that that's the way she feels about herself. That she
Got it.
is, that
Got it. Yeah.
that she is a non-denominational Christian. I guess she had to say, and I guess the implication of your question might be, well,
Hmm.
she felt she had to say Christian, but maybe she's really an agnostic. We might,
Right.
or we might.
So, okay, because another point was, I mean, something that I didn't really pick up on, and especially as a practicing Jew myself, I thought we had a lot more than one Jew on the court. I thought it was, I think, three at one point. Was it not?
I believe it was, yeah.
Right. So the fact that we're down to one Jew and I guess eight Christians, that's a lot less in the name of diversity as you were pitching for. That was just that just
Eight.
came across my Jewish brain.
Well, and there's a reason for that, I think, and that is, and I talk about this in the essay too.
Hmm.
We have mostly, and now as you pointed out, we have only one Jew on the court,
Yep.
and Christians. Um, but traditionally, because of Roe v. Wade, because of that one issue, you've had Republican presidents appointing Catholics to the Supreme Court because I think it was perceived that they would oppose abortion, and
Hmm.
they ultimately resorted, ultimately came to fruition in the Dobbs case. And on the other hand, Democratic presidents have typically considered at least nominating Jews to the Supreme Court because it has been felt that, well, they probably are more pro-choice and therefore hew towards the Democratic side. And of course, obviously, I guess uh, it is perceived maybe that Jews are more likely to be Democrats, obviously Democratic.
Of course, by the numbers, and so there was something else. So now transitioning a little bit more into the political sphere. Uh, your piece advocates really for more diversity and for a radical restructuring of the court. Why? What is your ideal court serve? What's the purpose of it, and how would your proposal further that progress?
I think the court should look more like the United States than it does today, for one thing. I think it should reflect some geographical diversity and educational diversity and experiential diversity. And by that I mean, uh, I'm sorry, there's a glare on my screen. I'm going to
That's all right.
screen
You
here.
do what you need to.
It's not all right, not with me. So I'm going to move
All
that.
right.
So yeah, and the other thing I talk about is experiential diversity, which is that these justices on the Supreme Court are primarily people who have served, who have been on courts, uh, and have done very little in the way of law practice outside of serving on a court, um, and have no other work experience essentially.
So okay, so now let's go into the restructuring you propose.
Okay.
45 justices. Who appoints them? Is there one president that's radically lucky to appoint an additional 37 justices? Uh I hope I did that right. 36. And what kind of rotation would there be? Would there be one court? I know you deal with the constitutionality of multiple panels of 9. So lay that out for us. What is your proposal?
Right. So one of the ideas is to also alter the circuit courts to some extent.
Hmm.
The Congress has considered from time to time splitting the Ninth Circuit into two circuits because it's the largest circuit. It's
Yeah.
fairly unwieldy, and it's not so radical to think about doing that. Um, California really could be its own uh, circuit court. And so the idea would be to add uh, circuit courts so that you have 15 circuit courts. And that way, in that manner, three justices from each of those 15 circuit courts would serve for a period of years on the Supreme Court. The president would still appoint those justices, uh, but they would rotate on the court and off every 5 years. So any particular justice who got appointed to serve on the Supreme Court would be there for 5 years and then would go back to the circuit to being a circuit judge in the circuit where he or she came from.
So by implication, the rotation is going to be a political process, is it not? Because depending on who takes which turn to get this to be part of the 9, that'll be a political process, just like it is now to pen people in the liberal versus conservative column, isn't it?
It will be political, no way to escape it. But with the rotation, at least you have some turnover on the court, and of course that 5-year term is 1 year more than a president serves. So you will get a little bit of less of politics than you have today.
So now, when it comes to that rotation, who determines the rotation? Is that something the Chief Justice would do? Is it something that the Congress would do?
I think Congress would probably have to do that.
Got it. And by your interpretation, the Congress has the mandate and ability to do that now, or would that require an amendment?
I believe the Constitution allows Congress to do that now. The Article 3 gives Congress the power to establish the courts. As you know, the lower courts, the establishment and structure of the lower courts is actually completely up to Congress in Article 3.
Mm-hmm.
All Article 3 says is that there shall be a Supreme Court, and lower courts, as the Congress may from time to time establish.
Right.
They have a lot of ability to restructure the courts, and there's nothing magical about 9 justices. And as you know, there have been other numbers.
Sure. Yeah.
On the Supreme Court from time to time. In fact, we started out with 6.
Yep.
I'm not sure why we did that, since there's no tiebreaker. But we did. And there have been 7 before. As you know, there have been proposals to add more justices beyond the 9. FDR, back in the New Deal era, wanted to add some justices and eventually dropped that idea because he didn't need to in order to get the New Deal approved.
So, bring it into today. Let's sort of circle back to where we began. The fiasco that happened after Scalia died, and then President Obama appointed Merrick Garland. What would have been quote unquote right in your eyes? The immediate granting of a hearing by McConnell. What would you have liked to see as an American?
We talked about that a little bit before we came on, and we talked about the democratic process and what the American people sort of expect and deserve of their democratic processes. And I think probably you can't really see one senator blocking those hearings as democracy in action. I think that when a president appoints someone to the Supreme Court, the Senate owes that president and owes that appointee and owes the American people a hearing. Let's hear why the president appointed that person to the Supreme Court. Let's hear what the arguments are against it. Let's let the person sit there and be grilled by the members of the Judiciary Committee. As has happened in the past, you may remember or you may not remember the Bork hearings.
No, I was born after that, but I'm pretty right in on that.
Right, and boy was he grilled. You know, it's
right.
It became a verb, being borked.
Right, yeah.
But that's okay. That's what the Senate Judiciary Committee is supposed to do. And,
so now, yeah, go ahead.
And so I think we should have seen that with the Merrick Garland appointment. Maybe the Senate would have voted against him. I don't know, but.
All right. Now, and what do you have to say about the flip side being true as well? I mean, with the passing of Justice Ginsburg.
Right, and immediately we
immediate within weeks.
And that was a very political process. Although I will say it was done within the realm of the democratic process. There were hearings. Amy Barrett sat before the Judiciary Committee and answered questions. And she, you'll recall, flouted the fact that she is not an Ivy League graduate.
Correct. Yeah.
It is in fact a bit of a Midwesterner, taught at Notre Dame, and
Hmm.
was a student at Notre Dame as well. So I actually think in that sense that's a little step in the right direction. But I don't so much have a problem with the fact that process was relatively brief. She had the appropriate hearings and she was voted on, so that's fine.
Okay. So when it comes to, let's say, the politicization of justices retiring during certain presidencies to potentially gift the either incumbent or incoming president an appointment to the court, or the ideological tally of 5-4, 6-3. What's to say that in your proposal of 45 justices or 45 rotating circuit court judges, the same tally won't be just magnified by 45 instead of just 9?
Well,
Go ahead.
yeah, sure. Obviously, justices have the right to retire if they want to. I think one way that might be mitigated is the fact that as those justices rotate off the Supreme Court, they would go back to the circuit courts where they served before. So they would continue in office after that, although they maybe would not have as much influence on the future of the law as they would on the Supreme Court. But um, the politicization of retirements is definitely an issue that we have today, and it's perhaps an issue that would not be entirely solved by my proposal. I'm not sure what you do about it. As
Mhm.
you know, there has been discussion about the possibility that if Donald Trump were elected uh, in a few weeks,
Yeah.
uh, that you might see the older Republican justices retire in order to allow Trump to appoint younger
Right.
conservatives.
Right. And then and I mean, Trump got 3 appointments, which is a third of the court. It's a wild number to shift. But something that bothered me as an American observer, uh like I wasn't around for Bork, but I read in on it, and I wasn't around for the confirmation of Thomas, but I also read in on that. Um Something I remember really closely, just because of how astutely I followed politics and current events, was the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh. And I couldn't help the thought of, if he weren't the shifter between 5-4 and 6-3 in the conservative liberal split on the Supreme Court, he would not have gone through what he gone through. Um, where do you stand on having the filibuster being applied to Supreme Court hearings? Should a filibuster rule be in effect, or is a simple majority of the Senate enough to go ahead and confirm Supreme Court nominees?
I agree with what you said about Justice Kavanaugh. With Justice Bork and other justices, the questioning by the Judiciary Committee has typically been political and legal, as it's supposed to
Hmm.
be. With Justice Kavanaugh, it was personal um, and not really political or legal at all. And it has turned out that Justice Kavanaugh is not exactly the most doctrinaire right-wing justice on the court. He
Yeah.
has, from time to time, agreed with the liberal justices on several cases. And I think Justice Kavanaugh has turned out to be a pretty good justice. But to answer your question about filibusters, I think a simple majority vote is what Americans expect, and I think, especially with regard to that issue of Supreme Court appointments, filibusters are sort of anti-democratic, as we were talking about before.
So I want to turn our attention to something like I referenced in the beginning of in the beginning of the podcast, I wanted to turn to the Gallup poll that was released this week. For those of you who are listening, I'll try to read out whatever I'm putting up on the screen. For those of you watching on video, feel free to check out this study for yourselves. This is Americans' evaluation of the Supreme Court and federal judicial branch. If you guys look at the center of the screen, Supreme Court job approval among Republicans is 72 to 19%. Independents 45-51, Democrats 15 to 83. This politicization of the court being split this much among party lines, and with the electoral advantage in the Electoral College and in the Senate of Republicans, do you think this is a recipe for delegitimizing the court?
Well, as you know, this is not the only. This survey, the Gallup survey, reflects what we see in public opinion in the public discourse these days. There's lots of discussion about the possibility, the danger that the court has been delegitimized. Even the Supreme Court justices who speak at college campuses during the break, their summer break, have been discussing this question. And absolutely.
And what kind of risk does that run to our country is where I'm going with it.
Well, enormous risk. I mean, the only reason we follow Supreme Court decisions is that is sort of historical, isn't it? I mean, is there really any?
It goes back to Andrew Jackson. Let him enforce the decision.
Exactly. Is there really an enforcement method? No. In many instances, there's not.
So now I'm going to shift into another point, going back to what I said about the Justice Breyer book that he released and flaunting the majority support of Americans. So if you're to see here a further finding in this study, right when Breyer wrote the book was around 2018-19, and he's in fact right. I mean, support was above 50% for a while, and it's still hovering right around there. This is in response to a question of how much trust and confidence do you have at this time in the judicial branch headed by the U.S. Supreme Court? A great deal, a fair amount, or not very much, none at all. And right now it's hovering for the great deal and fair amount around 48%. So that's pretty close to 50 if you want to take an optimistic look on things. But it's a significant dip from where we were in, let's say, 2018 of around 70%. And what's your reaction to that?
Democracy is fragile. It is far more fragile than we want to think. And it depends, in large part, I think, on the participation of the sort of the body politic. It depends on a consensus among Americans that we do things the way we do because the rule of law is important. And without the rule of law, what do we have? Well, we have anarchy. And so I think it's very, very important that the Supreme Court and the other branches of government do all we possibly can to support the rule of law. And I think it really comes down to that. I don't really believe that there's a whole lot we could do except for the possibility of some significant restructuring of the court and making it less political. That to reinforce the importance of the court and improve the American view of the court.
So when it comes, so I'm going to be closing out with this, or heading towards closing, and when considering the Dobbs case, I mean, you would know better than me. Did Dobbs come out at the end of 2023 or 22?
I think it's 22, but I'd have to look, to be honest.
Right, because I'm not sure if that's because the rapid decline here in the approval rating I'm showing is in 2020 was 67%. 2021, 54, 22, 47, 2023, 49%. I don't know if the decline is aligned more with the 6-3 majority or the Dobbs decision, which is an interesting thing that I'd have to look into, and shame on me for not doing it so far. But there's that element of things. Where I'm going with this is when we have a Supreme Court that is viewed as illegitimate, how much are we really losing out on in our democracy? Is the interpretive power that integral to our system of government? And maybe it was something that we can just do without. I mean, after all, the interpretive power only came in Marbury versus Madison. It wasn't even penned in the original Constitution.
That's right. It's not in the Constitution, and in fact, the Supreme Court sort of took it upon itself, as you know, in Marbury versus Madison. Um, and it, well, I think it's important in many ways for just more run-of-the-mill cases. The court in recent years has granted cert in cases that have great social significance, religious significance. It has tried, I think, to focus too much on sort of the social engineering part of law rather than the nuts and bolts of law. There are many things the court has to do, such as resolving splits between the circuits on points of federal law that most Americans probably aren't even aware of. So yeah, we need a Supreme Court. We need them to do the sort of the nitty gritty basic things that a Supreme Court does, uh, deciding how to interpret federal statutes. A somewhat controversial thing that the court did uh, last term is to decide that regulatory agencies have less power
Right. Yeah.
than they had held in the past. And another decision was the constitutionality of administrative law judges practicing before the SEC and making rulings on securities matters, particularly with regard to sanctions uh, on broker dealers in securities matters. The court took that power away from administrative law judges. Right or wrong, I don't really have a strong opinion about those issues, but those are the kinds of things a Supreme Court has to do. Who else is going to do it?
Got it.
So we need a Supreme Court. It's important just for uh, the gears to grind correctly, for things to work right with regard to the rule of law. What are trial judges to do, for example, if an appellate court hasn't decided a ruling, decided a mission? Um, so
Got it.
that we do need guidance from appellate courts. Yes.
Fair point. So it actually just came across my screen before. I'm going to put the approval rating back up. An interesting insight is the Dobbs decision came down in 2022. So this dip from 67% approval rating in 2020 to 2021, from 67% to 54%, actually came before Dobbs. Dobbs only costed the court, if you want to look at it that way, 7 points. The first 7 came. The first 13 points came as a result of just going from 5-4 to 6-3. So that's an interesting insight I saw from the Gallup poll.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
Dobbs had more impact because, as you know, it's an unpopular decision.
I do know that, and that's where I'm heading with it. This is the final point I'll hit on, and we'll close out. And this time I mean it. If in my judiciary class, I remember that we were talking about we spent significant amount of time on abortion cases and abortion in the United States. We went back to Roe versus Wade all the way until Mississippi case where Justice Roberts, I believe, was the 5th vote upholding a Missouri law, or it was something like that, where certain restrictions were placed on clinics where they could or couldn't operate with different medical practices in place. That point aside, I mean, I had a pretty liberal professor, and but he was straight. He knew what the course he was teaching, and this wasn't a place to spew political inclinations one way or another. He mentioned to me that, or he mentioned to the class, we've never discussed a matter for 50 years. Maybe, just maybe, we got it wrong. Maybe Roe was wrong. And this is a really liberal guy saying this in a really liberal campus. And I remember looking at that professor, I'm like, oh my God, you're gonna get rocked for saying this. But the overall point stuck with me. Liberal guy, liberal campus, but he dared to propose that they just got it wrong. Now, Dobbs overturning Roe, I mean, the only other case I can think of in overturning is, let's say, Brown v. Board of Ed. I mean, and that was a very, I guess, a very right overturning, a very correct overturning. Is that the way? If that's the way to say it? But maybe Roe was wrong. Now, did Dobbs go beyond Roe? Meaning, did they impose anything? No, they didn't. They just said Roe was voided and the states are for themselves. Do I think most of America agrees with Roe? I do. But in a constitutional way, I don't see how Roe really should stand. I know that it was Justice Brandeis who sort of laid the groundwork in terms of privacy rights within the Constitution, and then that's how Roe was related to a constitutional issue. But how do you see? I mean, do you give any credence to the argument that since Roe was the law of the land for 50 years, it should sort of stay because it was the law for half a century?
Well, there certainly is value in maintaining uh, important constitutional decisions like Roe, and the courts should not lightly overturn them. Um, and we know that the truth is that this is all very political, and we've talked about the makeup of the court and who appointed those judges and so forth. But even setting aside the issue of politics, I think it's important to do that, to maintain decisions. Was Roe wrong? Um, is there a right to privacy in the Constitution? I think in the decision you allude to, um, I think the majority opinion probably is not as well written as one of the concurring opinions, where the point is made that the structure of the Constitution is such that the government is a government of delegated powers, and all rights and powers that are not delegated to it are reserved to the people and the states. And of course, that's what the Ninth Amendment says very explicitly. So if there is a human right to privacy at all, it doesn't have to be set forth in the Constitution because it already existed. It pre-existed the United States. Um, and I think that point is made and I can't remember who wrote it. Sorry, but that point is made in the concurring
Mhm.
um, to that first opinion that found a right to privacy in the Constitution. Um, so I personally think Roe was rightly decided, but that's just
So what do you? So I'm going to press you on that a little more. What point do you have to make on what my professor was saying? And in my opinion, rightly so. What have we debated for 50 plus years that we just didn't get wrong? I mean, why was it a matter of debate until last year, or even still? No, let's stick with Roe. Why was Roe a matter of debate for 50 years?
it's a good question, and I think it's because of the nature of the religious right and the growing importance of the religious right in the Republican Party, um,
Mhm.
and their anti-abortion views, uh, and So I really think that's why Roe and the debate about it stuck with us and grew to the point where we ended up with Dobbs. Now, I will say that for that decision and for many, I tend to take a more what I think is a more constitutional perspective, but you might call it a libertarian view, which is that maybe the courts don't really have a lot of business deciding issues like this. Um, and in a sense, that's what Dobbs does. It leaves it up to the states.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but perhaps my own view with regard to abortion is that I tend to be personally opposed to it, just on I guess religious, ethical, moral grounds. But I don't think the government ought to tell people what to do
Yeah.
about issues like that, particularly where they are as personal as abortion.
I know. I mean, personally, I've always been torn until I started having kids of my own and seeing what's really out there. It's a deeply personal thing. The only argument I get, I understand, don't necessarily agree with, is, well, it's the government's job to prevent murder, isn't it? And then when is it considered a person? And then you get into a whole muck of an argument. But
Yes, you do.
uh, if you'd like to put any questions in the chat, I'd be more than happy to feature them. I'm going to be closing it out with Steve just in a bit. Just make sure you get those questions in, and then we will be able to wrap it up for this week. So overall, path forward. I mean, there's no way of saying. I mean, this the whole proposal of 45 on a court, rotating, changing the format of let's say the circuit court levels. It'll require a lot, and it'll require more education. Not everybody knows that the difference between a circuit, district, and Supreme Court. How do you see any form of solution materializing? Is it just go ahead publicizing proposals like this? Is it backing certain candidates? Is it is President Biden appointing a commission to reform the Supreme Court a step in the right direction? Where do you see it progressing from here? Proposals like yours.
Yes, it absolutely is a step in the right direction. As you know, and you alluded to it just a minute ago, there is a report that that President Biden, that was created by the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That was produced in December of 2021. That commission reviewed the various proposals for reforming the Supreme Court. It's not as though we don't all know that these proposals are out there. And they go through the entire history of the judicial power and the origin of the Supreme Court. And they talk about membership and the size of the court. They review the history of efforts to alter the size of the court, whether it's legal to do that. And they talk about other proposed structural reforms. They don't talk about one exactly like mine, but they do talk about some similar ones.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about term limits, for example, as well. And they don't really come to any conclusions. That's what presidential commissions do, as you know. They don't ever really come to conclusions and say, well, here's what we recommend. But term limits is something we haven't talked about, but it's another possibility. But as you know, it would require a constitutional amendment, and
Yeah.
that's probably going nowhere.
All right. Okay. So I can't leave you without asking, what's your take on the current presidential cycle? And feel free to either dodge or relate it back to the subject matter.
I do not believe I have ever seen such an intense ending to the presidential campaign as we have this year. You mentioned I think maybe when we were talking before, you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned your first presidential election. Well, my first one was 1972.
All
Uh,
right.
and I have voted for Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians over my time. I usually just
Mm-hmm.
look at the issues and think about my own personal views and the people. Um, but I've never seen such an intense political cycle as this one. Uh, I think it got compressed because of Biden's resignation from the appointment and
Hmm.
Vice President Harris. That's part of the reason why we are engaging in such an intense cycle here, because she had only a few months to campaign. But I have actually been reading recently uh, some. I've read Mary Trump's books. I've read some uh, other. I think Bob Woodward has a new book out,
War.
uh,
It's called
and
War. That just came out, and it's amazing.
and so I think it's time that we considered the possibility of a woman as president of the United States. I like Kamala Harris. I like her background. I think she's very bright. I think she's very strong and tough. And she spent 8 years as, uh, just in terms of her administrative experience, she spent 8 years as head of one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the world. That's a anything you say about California is that it's one of the largest whatever. It's one of the
Hmm.
largest economies in the world, and that was a huge task, a huge job, and she did it well. As far as I know, I don't really know anybody who criticizes her very much about her work as the Attorney General. Some people may criticize the fact that she prosecuted criminals and that she, from time to time, supported the death penalty and so forth. But that's what prosecutors do. Uh,
Right.
that's their job.
Right.
So uh, if you're asking me personally, who am I voting for? I'm voting for Harris.
Gotcha. All right. All right, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. Audience, hope that was enlightening. Feel free to post any questions, comments, insults, or compliments down below. And hope to have you back on. This was a really nice discussion.
Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate it.
Have a great day, guys.